And let's pause to take an in-depth look now at Russia's war on Ukraine. As I said, the eve, tomorrow is the 2-year anniversary of Russia's campaign. Chris Brown is our CBC News 4 correspondent. You know, he covered the war, covered throughout, but certainly in its very beginning stages, he's going to be with us. But before we get to a conversation with Chris, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky famously told Western allies in those early hours of the war he didn't need to be airlifted from Kyiv to escape the Russian onslaught. He needed ammunition. Well, now, 2 years later, with U.S. help in limbo, he still needs ammunition.
Will Ukrainians survive without Congress support? Of course, but not all of us. And if we understand this price, if the world is ready for this, okay, you will see it. But it's tragedy. It will be tragedy for all of us, not only for Ukraine, not only for Ukrainians, for all Europe.
That is Volodymyr Zelensky in an interview with Fox News following a major loss for Ukraine. Russian forces now hold Avdiivka. That's Russia's first battlefield victory in months. It's reported to be a victory at terrible cost for Russia, with thousands of troops killed. Ukrainian forces reportedly suffered major losses, too, trying to defend Avdiivka. And it's unclear just how many died in what surviving Ukrainian troops call a chaotic retreat. I mentioned Chris Brown. Let's bring him in. He's from London now, but of course, we certainly spoke often in those early stages. And Chris, I'm glad to have some time with you today. I'm interested in getting your thoughts, first of all. Overall, where do things stand after these 2 years of brutal fighting?
I think, Heather, when you and I spoke about this time last year, it's fair to say this spot now is not where the Ukrainians hoped they'd be, not by a long shot. The front lines, although they are fluid, as you mentioned, and constantly moving, really haven't changed in the way that Ukraine's generals wanted them to. And in that Fox interview you just played with Vladimir Zelensky, he did talk about having more surprises in store for Russia, even a new offensive. But really, a year ago, whereas Ukraine had the offensive, now it's Russia that does. Ukraine is weaker, both military and also politically, than a year ago. And I think it's also fair to say Russia is stronger. We've seen lots of components for Russian weapons still making it into the country. And Putin has also found a way to import drones, rockets and missiles, artillery shells from North Korea and Iran. Politically, too, for Ukraine, both inside and internationally, as we've seen, things are very unsettled. You talked about the congressional bill, the Republicans holding up billions of dollars in badly needed military assistance. And internally, Ukraine has also just switched up its most popular war leader, General Zelensky, who led the defense of the country for the first 2 years. So there's a real weariness and, let's say, confidence, too, about Ukraine eventually being able to push Russian forces out of the country. I think that is being severely tested now, Heather.
Chris, in that interview, we heard Zelensky repeat the warning that he's been giving since the war began, and that is that Vladimir Putin won't stop with Ukraine, that his country needs Western military support to survive, talking specifically about ammunition. How does last week's death, 1 week ago, the death of Alexei Navalny, how does that affect the West's willingness to help, in your view?
Well, from a Ukrainian point of view, they never really saw Navalny as anything, certainly not as a savior for them in jail or free. Even though from behind his prison bars, he did oppose the war. Ukrainians remember that Navalny did not oppose Putin snatching Crimea from them in 2014, nor, I think it's also fair to say, do Ukrainians really believe in anyone's mission to make Russia a democracy. Most believe that being ruled by a strongman is something that's baked into the Russian DNA. But as far as if his death has a consequence of consolidating Western support, I think it's fair to say they would take it. My sense is some of what we hear of war fatigue outside of Ukraine might be a little bit overemphasized. The opinion polls that have been coming out this week across the EU suggest there still is strong backing for Ukraine, also in Canada and even in the United States as well. Vladimir Putin, as you talked about, appears to be more powerful than ever, but still Russia has underlying severe economic problems. It's also suffering from war fatigue too, and it's interesting the Kremlin seems to be so concerned about maintaining that support for Putin that it's even worried about having a public funeral for Alexei Navalny, and authorities there are trying to stop it just in case it attracts a big anti-war crowd.
I want to ask about one of the strategies we've seen from Canada, but also Ukraine's allies, pairing that military support, Chris, with sanctions against Russia. More are coming today from both the EU and from the United States later today. 2 years into the war, is the sanctions strategy having an effect?
It certainly is having an effect, but it's not having a total effect. And I think very few people who are putting these sanctions in expect that it would have the effect of stopping the war. Russia has a very strong shadow economy. They got very good at it over 70 some odd years of communism. And we've been seeing these big trade spikes between countries such as the UK and Germany and Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where suddenly a lot of stuff seems to be going into these places and ending up in Russia, including parts for airplanes, helicopters, and drones. But what we have seen is the sanctions have served as a brake on Russia's economy, deprived it of hundreds of billions of US dollars a year. Oil exports have been hit hard. Revenue from that is down 25% because of a price cap. There is a lot more that could be done. And one thing you keep here coming up is about confiscating Russian assets, giving them to Ukraine. There's a lot of Russian assets in European financial capitals, but the fear is if they do that, if they take those over, then the sovereign wealth funds of other countries like the Saudi Arabians, UAE, Africa, they would react by pulling their assets out. So that's a huge hammer. The West has it, but so far it's been unwilling to use it.
Let me ask you finally, 2-year anniversary tomorrow, and then into a third year of this war, Chris. Despite that recent victory in Avdiivka I was just talking about, the war experts would say, I think majority, that it's effectively a stalemate. How might this war end?
Well, a lot is going to depend, I think, Heather, on what the U.S. House does. Do they approve or kill that Ukraine military aid bill? It's certainly an enormous decision. Some would even say it's an existential one for Ukraine. At the same time, I think there have been some fairly positive developments in the recent weeks, in part because of that. We've seen a lot of European countries trying to step up and fill some of these gaps in military support. Denmark is coming through with more F-16s. It's handed all of its artillery over to Ukraine. Germany and Sweden have come through with huge military packages worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And we've heard about the Czech Republic trying to broker this deal to bring in hundreds of thousands of artillery shells to Ukraine from third parties. And it's possible Canada will even be a part of that as well. But I think going forward, Ukraine really needs to articulate some military goals for the coming months. Otherwise, the morale problems and all the political challenges are going to intensify. They have had success at attacking the Black Sea Fleet in Russia. They've been able to strike at strategic targets way behind Russian lines like refineries. So in the absence of these battlefield victories, these other kind of accomplishments are going to be really important, I think, for 2024.
Chris, I've appreciated your perspective over the last 2 years and this morning as well. Thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Chris Brown.